My name is Rain Hanna, and it is truly an honor for me to moderate this evening's panel on the Assyrian Global Governance Initiative. Before we begin our presentation, I would like to introduce to you our panelists, Mr. Michael Youash here from Canada, a man you all know, of course, very well, Mr. Ephraim Yacob, and Mr. Mardin Isaac, who's here from London. We'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the Assyrian Confederation of Europe for organizing such a wonderful conference and giving us the platform to have this important discussion. As you all know, for the first time in our history, the majority of Assyrians currently reside outside of what is considered our traditional homeland. As the crisis continues to unfold in the Middle East and the very existence of Assyrians is threatened, we in the diaspora are confronted with a series of choices and decisions, and chief among them is the question, how can we survive? For centuries, we have sought the answer to this question outside of ourselves, and what we've come to realize with time, however terrifying or discouraging the realization may be, is that we are on our own. And when we are brave enough to accept this fact, we will also realize that the responsibility lies with each and every one of us to secure a future for our people, if we believe in one. And with that realization that self-reliance is critical to our survival, will be the recognition of our own strength and our own potential. And with that said, I would like to turn it over to Michael Youash. Michael is an Assyrian scholar and advocate who has worked extensively on issues of governance and security, specifically in relation to the Nineveh Plain in Iraq. He's an expert on questions of legislation and advocacy in the context of American-Iraqi engagement and has led and coordinated efforts by the Assyrian community in the United States over the past decade. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Michael Youash.
Mishora Bainamarin Basimarav Kachetan Lacha from Ephraim Yacob and the Assyrian Confederation of Europe. It really is a privilege and an honor to be here. And I really want to thank all of you for coming and taking this very important step. I also want to thank one of the drivers behind Assyrian global governance in terms of recognizing the spirit for it and the need to support it, Mr. Ninos Turnian from ANB SAT. And as you'll see in my presentation as just an example of what Ganan Taganan looks like, I also want to say thank you to Rabbi Johnny Yapu, who's here from Atra in terms of the NPU, and the work that we're doing in terms of the Nineveh Plain Defense Fund and the NPU. And you'll see why I bring this, because it touches into the presentation that we're developing. Sapere ode is a Latin term. From the first book of letters, from Horace. It actually helped fuel the Renaissance. And it loosely translates into dare to know. Have courage in the face of the truth, because we don't always like the truth. And when we don't like the truth, we kind of switch off, or we only look for selective truths, truths that reinforce what we want to hear. And my message for well over a year and a half now has been that we must shake ourselves out of this illusion. Assyrian global governance is the process of moving away from it with the courage in the face of the truth, or sapere ode. We must accept that for over 100 years of discussing genocide, experiencing genocide, studying genocide, the one thing that we've never looked at is our own actions during a century of genocide. And I would say that we've invested for 100 years in a failed methodology. And this is what we must begin to accept, that for 100 years, the Assyrian nationalist agenda, as how it's mobilized and organized itself, has been in pursuit of a completely failed structure. We all know the famous book. I'm going to assume we all know. I grew up with a book that my uncle brought home for me from Chicago when I was a child, actually. The Assyrian Question, Professor Joseph Yacob's book. I grew up on that book, among others. The Assyrian Question actually is a term from the League of Nations onwards, because there was a committee to resolve the Assyrian Question. Other countries, the great powers, Western nations, would decide our fate. That is the Assyrian Question as foreign determination, and that's how we're hardwired. The courage to accept the truth will lead us to the Assyrian question as self-determination. We must break out of Assyrian organization and mobilizing for Westerners and others to save us. They never have. We must start to organize to help ourselves. So, building off of the comments by Afram, ACE is established to engage Western governments, and we're not saying we disengage from Western governments, but my emphasis is on the latter part, self-help. And just very quickly, as I go through this, I'll go into detail in terms of the United States government. In Sweden, whereas Akram says, we have the largest demographic concentration of Assyrians, actually over 1%. And yet when you engage the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for a policy of direct assistance, the answer is no. Years ago at the House of Commons, we had an extensive debate on the Nineveh Plains. No action from the UK government. An EU non-binding resolution on genocide recognition. What did it result into? What did it produce? Nothing. The Assyrian question is foreign determination in the United States. Resolutions, legislation, direct policy action that I'm going to elaborate for you now, but in conclusion, you'll understand that the result has been not only zero, in fact, we've actually harmed ourselves through some of these policies. I'm only doing a short summary here because the latter part of my presentation is for ACE, is for the audience on Assyrian global governance. In 2008, appropriation bill, historic, $10 million targeting ethnic and religious minorities in the Nineveh Plains. This is unprecedented legislation. In fact, over the next 4 years, we appropriated $42 million. Did we benefit from it? Most of the money went through the Kurdistan regional government and was actually used to oppress us financially. In 2012, that's on the humanitarian side, in terms of humanitarian aid and development program. The monies that we appropriated were actually used to oppress us. In 2012, we developed an agenda for the Nineveh Plains province, and it actually passed into legislation. The committee directs the Department of State to submit a report not later than 90 days after the enactment of this act, detailing U.S. efforts to help these communities, including assistance consistent with Article 125, assistance in building an indigenous community police force in the Nineveh Plains, and efforts to support NGOs in the region. None of it was implemented. In 2015, actually passed in June 2014, when there was no official Assyrian lobby in Washington, D.C. We didn't even need to be there. And they passed legislation for a Nineveh Plains administrative province. But imagine, nobody was there to make it happen physically, because these are words on paper now. These are words on paper. In 2008, after our security forces were dismantled in 2006 again by the Kurdistan regional government, in 2008 we finally got progress to unblock the order to create a formal security force in the Nineveh Plains. The Interior Ministry issued the order in 2006. Then Congressman Kirk, now Senator Kirk, then Congressman Kirk unblocked the order politically in Washington, D.C. to create our force and start a process. The goal was to reach upwards of 5,000. But by August 2008, the KDP-controlled Nineveh Plains province issued an order dismantling the force, reassigning it, taking it apart, and the United States military force on the ground watched it happen and didn't intervene on our behalf. And now let me come to U.S. recognition of genocide. We all know on March 17, 2016, Secretary of State John Kerry said, My purpose in appearing before you today is to assert that in my judgment, Daesh is responsible for genocide against groups and areas under its control, including Yazidis, Christians, and Shia Muslims. That was March 17th. The same day, Department of State officials said that the finding, genocide recognition, an achievement, imposes no new obligations beyond what is already being done, but that it could galvanize other countries to step up the battle against the Islamic State. So in the same breath that the State Department, the US government recognized genocide, they said, but this doesn't create any new obligation for action on us. In fact, we're already doing our part. We hope other countries do something. We have proven, again from the State Department, on the same day, we have proven our willingness to step in and prevent acts of genocide. Moving on, is it going to trigger something new? No. They recognize genocide, but they don't see it as an obligation to do anything more than what they're doing. This is the result of lobbying. This is the result of that advocacy. We have to begin to acknowledge these truths. The next two slides basically indicate that whether it was Rwanda in 1990, don't think that the Americans not acting is because we're Assyrians. In 1994 in Rwanda, the same message. Recognition of genocide imposes no obligation on the United States government. 2004, Sudan, the recognition of genocide imposes no new obligation on the United States government. And yet, we poured all of our advocacy efforts into genocide recognition. But let's take a historical perspective on this. When I say this has been a failed model for a century, what you're looking at now is a letter exchange between Marshamun and Sir Francis Humphreys, representative of Her Majesty from the United Kingdom. In this letter exchange, Sir Francis Humphreys says, "Your Beatitude, I have forwarded to the Secretary of State the Assyrian petition of the 17th June, and the British government are now in communication with the League of Nations Secretariat with a view to arranging for its early consideration by a competent League body. The Assyrian question as foreign determination in 1932. Marshamun wrote back to Sir Francis Humphreys, and I'll only summarize here. Your Excellency, and what this exchange was about was the levies, our security forces. The British were saying, we want your levies to stay with us in the center and in the south. And Marshamun is saying, I will only do that if you consider our national petition at the League of Nations, because my people are insecure in the north. Their fighters, our fighters, want to go back and protect their villages, protect their families. But Marshamun said, I will promise to do my best in persuading the leaders to consent and the levies to prolong their services if your Excellency will write and assure me on your honor that you will consider our proposal. What is the answer? Sir Francis Humphreys writes, Your Beatitude, I have received your message of the 25th of June. It is my duty to explain that some of the demands contained in the national petition of the 17th of June appear to be in conflict with the declared policy of my government and the League. I undertake to support to the best of my ability with my government and the League of Nations those demands which appear to be reasonable and in conformity with the general policy of my government and the League. Your sincere friend, Francis Humphreys. What happened in 1933? Everyone? The Cement Massacre. And our faith was in the Assyrian question as foreign determination. In 2007, one of the pieces of legislation we passed, you can see it in other presentations, was a report that the United States government, that the State Department was obligated to deliver about our plight. And in it, what do they write? In Nineveh, the Christian minority faces considerable hardship. Some factions are underrepresented politically. Some suffer from uneven. What does that mean, underrepresented politically? It means they were aware that the Peshmerga entered Deshtiginwe, collected the ballot boxes, and brought them back in the evening full. That our independent political groups were not represented fully. Some suffer from uneven resource transfers from the Kurdistan Regional Government's Ministry of Finance. Through Finance Minister Sergis Aghajan, the State Department in 2007 was aware that we were being socioeconomically persecuted. And some experienced human rights abuses, physical harm, with the KRG controlling the area. But what was their finding? On the basis of relative need, it would be inappropriate to single out this group for special attention. 1932, your demands are unreasonable. It's not in the interest of Her Majesty's government. And in 2007, this is the Assyrian question as foreign determination. And what amazes me, and what my message to the Assyrian people is that we have only demonstrated faith and steadfastness in the Assyrian question as foreign determination. What is faith? Faith is belief that is not based on proof. We believe in foreigners saving us, in foreign salvation, in the absence of proof. In fact, we've only had proof that it doesn't work. When will we come to accept this? When will we come to understand that the Assyrian question as foreign determination has left us destroyed? And that we have been steadfast. The definition of steadfast is fixed in a direction, unwavering. Despite repeated lessons from 1932, from 1914, until the present, 100 years later, we are fixed faithfully and steadfastly on the Assyrian question as foreign determination. What is faith? Faith is belief that is not based on proof. We believe in foreigners saving us, in foreign salvation, in the absence of proof. In fact, we've only had proof that it doesn't work. When will we come to accept this? When will we come to understand that the Assyrian question as foreign determination has left us destroyed? And that we have been steadfast. The definition of steadfast is fixed in a direction, unwavering. Despite repeated lessons from 1932, from 1914, until the present, 100 years later, we are fixed faithfully and steadfastly on the Assyrian question as foreign determination. Let me very quickly tell you what Assyrian global governance is not. Assyrian global governance is not the Assyrian Universal Alliance, which was established as part of its principles to diligently advocate the Assyrian cause internationally, urging democratic governments and international bodies to act. It is not the International Confederation of the Assyrian Nation, developed as an idea by Rabbi Ivan Takovich, who said, at the core of it is the Assyrian case presented to the international community. And it is not the current push under the Assyrian parliament, which seeks to create an entire representative assembly, but to do what? The Assyrian question as foreign determination. Assyrian global governance is the reorganization of the Assyrian nation globally to begin developing and exercising self-help, self-reliance. It is only when we start working to help ourselves. This is an unexplored option that we might begin to achieve results. So for now, Rain, how am I doing for time? 3 minutes? For now, I'm going to take that as 6. For now, I just want to introduce you to principles, sharwe, mabadi, of Assyrian global governance. We heard fantastic explanations on the need for ACE, and I agree with all of them in terms of it is about structuring and organizing our people on a European scale. We have to support this. It is an essential measure. But all governance structures need to be guided by principles. Let me give you an example. I work in constitutional design, institutional design. my contracts overseas were about designing parliamentary systems. They have to be guided by principles. The US Constitution is guided by principles before they wrote the articles. What is one of them? Very simple. Large groups in control of power do harm to smaller groups. America is created by people who fled this place, who fled Europe. They were minorities persecuted by majorities with lots of centralized power. So one of the things they learned as a principle is if you put too much power in a large majority's hand, it will hurt others. So they developed institutions, but with that principle in mind. So for example, checks and balances between Congress, in the Senate and the House of Reps, separation of powers, the judiciary from the president from Congress. These we look at as just systems, as structures, but they're guided by fundamental principles. So what are some of the principles that should guide, in my view, Assyrian global governance? Autonomy or sovereignty. Here I'm talking about decisional autonomy. The capacity for Assyrians to make decisions for themselves. That is autonomy. Now, what does this mean? I can tell you the principle, but I have to illustrate it for you. So, for example, the Kurdistan Democratic Party created a political party called Majlis Shabi. They created it. It is the creation of Nukhrai, of others, for us. In essence, this group does not possess decisional autonomy. It cannot make decisions for itself. Others make decisions for it. So the idea of autonomy or sovereignty as a principle would preclude that type of entity. This is not something specific to Assyrians. In the United States government, it is illegal to accept foreign campaign contributions. Why? Because the Americans didn't want Nukhraya influencing their politicians. Why should we not operate on the same premise? If it's good enough for them, it's good enough for us. Ganan Kaganan, Assyrians for Assyrians. We are on our own. The Assyrian Federation of Sweden is a federation we should all be proud of. It has fantastic leadership. It has built itself up. And then the government of Sweden stepped in to engage them. But it is when Assyrians started working locally, aggressively, and building strength that foreign governments came in. We're not saying that we reject foreign interaction, but it must come on terms when we're building ourselves up, under the principle of Ganan Taganan. The Nineveh Plains Protection Unit is an example of the same. It is an effort started by our community, started by our people, built up by our community, but then what happens? Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Results says, look at this group. They are doing something. Our interests align with their interests. This is not happening because of their love for Assyrians or their love of Deshret Ninweh. A great power, the United States, is saying, here are people who we share interests with. They're doing something for themselves. We can work with them. It's a partnership. But it starts when we start helping ourselves. Ganan Taganan. Indigeneity. We are an indigenous people. We are nationalists, but let's remember there are different forms of nationalism. The nationalism of Europe has a tremendously ugly history. It has fueled world wars. We don't have to be bound by that version of nationalism. Our nationalism, our indigeneity, is about a nationalism of reclamation, it's been called. About taking back what's ours, taking back even our dignity. For example, to illustrate what I'm talking about, a standardized education that's global. So I would also like to recognize Malfono Afram Yildiz, who's here, who's devoted so much time and energy to an entire education curricula that can guide us as an Assyrian people globally. And yet we also have Atra. It's about land return and resettlement. It's not about taking land from other people. It's about taking back land that's been taken from us. Non-territoriality. We have, this is another principle, just as an illustration. We have indigeneity in Atra. It is about our land. It is Assyria. It is occupied Assyria. But we also have a huge diaspora. And we have to build in on this principle that sometimes the necessities in Atra and the necessities in diaspora require a filter. We cannot cross-contaminate. We cannot hurt one at the expense of the other. Let me give an example here. Again, another illustration. In 2003, a historically significant conference took place to declare the need to carve out territory in the Nineveh Plains as a federal unit, a subnational federal unit. Now, in pursuit of that political strategy was a very prudent policy. We are one nation, unity, Chaldo-Assyrian, an effort to bridge divides across sectarian groups and identity, fusing identity together to produce an agenda for the Nineveh Plains. But we can say that in diaspora, the agenda in Atra had a confusing effect, sometimes a harmful effect on organizations in the diaspora. We have to develop, it doesn't mean that what happened in Atra is bad. It means we have to develop systems and institutions that are guided by an awareness on non-territoriality and territoriality, that maybe what's good for Atra needs a system to filter to the diaspora, to shield the diaspora. And maybe what's good for diaspora is not always good for Atra. We have to design institutions that establish immunity for each other, but always pursuing shared goals for the bigger picture. These are fundamental principles that should guide Assyrian global governance. So what are the next steps? We are meeting in Spain in terms of all governance areas that can bring us together, that are interests in Atra and in diaspora, but we are seeking a mandate. This will not proceed without a mandate from the Assyrian Confederation of Europe, from national federations, from local organizations, affiliated and non-affiliated. This has to be a message internalized by our Shotopriyate, because that's our infrastructure. The federations, the confederations, the local associations in diaspora are the infrastructure on which to build. After Spain, an extended Assyrian global governance mandate via greater organizational consolidation. So the creation of a confederation and strengthening a confederation can only be good for global governance. In fact, they're interdependent. What is the long-term vision? The long-term vision is not the Assyrian question as foreign determination. Eventually, building up that Assyrian strength, that Assyrian power, where it is the Assyrian Question Resolution Council. It is not London, Washington, Geneva, Brussels answering the Assyrian question. It is Assyrians answering the Assyrian question. Thank you very much.